Thunder cracked across the Montana sky as Sheriff Samuel Grayson rode toward the abandoned MacAlister Ranch, a property that had remained empty since old man MacAlister's death 3 summers past. The year was 1885, and Whiskey Creek had seen its share of trouble, but none quite like the storm brewing on the horizon, both in the skies and in Samuel's hardened heart. The townspeople of Whiskey Creek knew better than to cross Sheriff Grayson. In his 5 years wearing the Tin Star, he'd earned a reputation for being fair but utterly merciless. Men who broke the law found themselves facing the full consequence of their actions without an ounce of compassion. Women who tried to charm their husbands out of jail cells learned quickly that batting eyelashes had no effect on the stone-faced lawman. Cold as the winter mountains, Mrs. Henderson from the general store would say. "That man's got iron instead of blood," the blacksmith often remarked. "Reckon his heart died along with his family in that fire," whispered others when they thought Samuel couldn't hear. Samuel adjusted his hat against the quickening wind, squinting at the dilapidated MacAlister property. The county judge had finally declared it abandoned, which meant he needed to post the official notice. The property would go up for auction next month. As he approached, he noticed something unexpected: smoke rising from the chimney. Squatters. It wasn't uncommon in these parts, especially with winter approaching. Samuel's jaw tightened as he dismounted from his horse, a magnificent black stallion named Thunder. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip as he approached the front door. Without bothering to knock, he pushed open the door, hand resting on his weapon. "This is Sheriff Grayson. You're trespassing on private property." What he saw inside made him pause. A young woman with auburn hair stood by the hearth, a cast-iron skillet in her hand. Her simple blue dress was dusty from travel, but even covered in road dirt, she had a natural beauty that momentarily caught Samuel off guard. "Sheriff," she said, nodding politely but without a hint of fear. "I'm Rebecca Blackstone. I believe you're mistaken about the trespassing." She placed the skillet on the stovetop and reached into a leather satchel, retrieving a folded document. "I purchased this property 3 weeks ago from Judge Harmon in Helena." Samuel took the document with suspicious eyes, scanning the legal language. It appeared authentic, complete with the territorial seal. "Judge Harmon had no right to sell this property," Samuel said, his voice cold. "MacAlister land falls under Whiskey Creek jurisdiction." Rebecca's green eyes narrowed slightly. "With all due respect, Sheriff, I traveled over 200 miles to start a new life here. I paid good money for this property. If there's a legal dispute, I'm happy to resolve it, but I won't be leaving tonight." Samuel studied her. Most women cowered under his gaze, but Rebecca Blackstone stood straight-backed and unwavering. "Town's 5 miles east. First thing tomorrow, we'll sort this at the courthouse. Until then, you can stay, but don't get comfortable, Miss Blackstone." As he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. "Sheriff, would you care for some coffee before you ride back? That storm's picking up something fierce." Samuel paused at the doorway. The woman was right. The skies had darkened considerably, and the first heavy drops of rain were beginning to fall. Still, he'd ridden through worse. "No, thank you," he replied curtly, stepping back into the growing storm. Rebecca followed him to the doorway. "At least take this," she said, offering a piece of cloth-wrapped cornbread. "Can't have the town's sheriff collapsing from hunger on my account." Samuel almost refused, but his stomach betrayed him with a growl. It had been hours since he'd eaten. Reluctantly, he took the offering with a curt nod. No smile, no thanks, just the barest acknowledgement. As he mounted Thunder, the rain now falling steadily, he caught her smiling at him, a genuine, warm smile that seemed completely unbothered by his coldness. For the briefest moment, something stirred in Samuel's chest, something he hadn't felt in years. He quickly pushed it away, spurring Thunder into motion as the rain pelted down harder. Rebecca Blackstone would be gone by tomorrow afternoon once he sorted out this property confusion, just another drifter passing through his town. By the time Samuel reached Whiskey Creek, he was soaked to the bone. The cornbread remained untouched in his saddlebag as he stabled Thunder and made his way to his modest quarters behind the jail. Only when the door closed behind him did he retrieve the cloth-wrapped bundle. The cornbread was still warm somehow, protected by the thick cloth. Samuel sat at his small table and took a bite. The taste transported him instantly sweet, moist, with just a hint of honey. It had been years since he'd eaten cornbread this good. Not since he stopped the thought before it could form fully. Breaking off another piece, he noticed something written on the inside of the cloth. In neat handwriting, it read, "A little kindness costs nothing but gives everything." Samuel scoffed, tossing the cloth aside. Philosophy from a squatter. Still, he finished every crumb of the cornbread before settling into his cold, empty bed. Morning came with clear skies and a town already buzzing with news of the woman at the MacAlister place. Samuel made his way to Judge Potter's office early, determined to resolve the issue quickly. Territorial sale, you say? Judge Potter adjusted his spectacles, examining the document Samuel had described. That's peculiar. Let me check the records. While the judge rummaged through his filing cabinet, the door to his office opened. Rebecca Blackstone entered, looking considerably more put together than she had the previous day. Her auburn hair was neatly pinned up, and she wore a modest but well-tailored green dress that matched her eyes. "Miss Blackstone," Samuel acknowledged with a curt nod. "Sheriff Grayson," she replied, that same unfazed smile playing at her lips. "I thought I might save you the trouble of riding back out." Judge Potter cleared his throat. "Ah, Miss Blackstone, we were just discussing your property claim." "And I hope to clear up any confusion," she said, approaching the desk. "My father was James Blackstone, Judge Harmon's brother-in-law. When he passed last month, the judge suggested I use my inheritance to purchase property here in Whiskey Creek. He handled the transaction personally." Samuel frowned. That still doesn't explain why he sold property that wasn't officially up for auction yet. Judge Potter had found what he was looking for. "Actually, Samuel, it appears everything is in order. Judge Harmon contacted me by telegraph 3 weeks ago about this very matter. I granted permission for the direct sale given the family connection." He pushed a telegram across the desk. Samuel read it twice, looking for any irregularity. Finding none, he felt a mixture of annoyance and, oddly, relief. "Well then," he said stiffly, "I apologize for the confusion, Miss Blackstone. Welcome to Whiskey Creek." "Thank you, Sheriff," Rebecca replied, her smile never wavering. "I hope we can start fresh. Perhaps you could recommend some reliable workers. The ranch needs significant repairs before winter sets in fully." Before Samuel could respond, Judge Potter jumped in enthusiastically. "The Jensen boys are good workers, though they charge a fair penny. Cheaper option would be the Wallace brothers, but they're slower." Rebecca nodded gratefully. "I appreciate the advice, Judge Potter." She turned back to Samuel. "And thank you, Sheriff, for your diligence in protecting the town's interests." With that, she departed, leaving behind a subtle scent of lavender and an inexplicable tension in Samuel's shoulders. "Remarkable young woman," Judge Potter commented, returning the telegram to his files. "Traveled all this way alone after losing her father. Takes courage." Samuel grunted noncommittally. "Town doesn't need more complications." "A young woman starting a ranch hardly counts as a complication, Samuel," the judge chuckled. "Unless you're worried she'll soften that reputation of yours." Samuel didn't dignify that with a response. He had work to do, real work that didn't involve green-eyed women with disarming smiles. Over the next 2 weeks, Whiskey Creek buzzed with talk of Rebecca Blackstone. Samuel did his best to ignore it, but snippets inevitably reached his ears. She'd hired the Jensen boys and 2 others to repair the ranch house and barn. She'd purchased livestock chickens, 2 milk cows, and was negotiating for horses. She'd even planted a late garden, though most folks thought it foolish with winter approaching. "She asked about you," Mrs. Henderson mentioned casually when Samuel came to the general store for supplies. "Who did?" He asked, though he knew perfectly well. Miss Blackstone, of course, wanted to know if you had family in town. The shopkeeper eyed him curiously. Never seen a woman so unaffected by your scowling, Samuel Grayson. Samuel ignored the comment. I need coffee and ammunition, Mrs. Henderson. She paid Tommy Wallace's doctor bill, did you hear that? Mrs. Henderson continued, measuring coffee beans. Boy fell from her roof while working, broke his arm clean through. She not only paid Doc Morrison but gave the family extra to cover the wages Tommy will lose while healing. Despite himself, Samuel felt a flicker of admiration. Most newcomers to Whiskey Creek looked out only for themselves. The ammunition, Mrs. Henderson, he prompted. The shopkeeper sighed, placing a box of bullets on the counter. One day, Sheriff, someone's going to crack that shell of yours, and I pray I live long enough to see it. Samuel paid for his purchases and left without another word. His rounds took him past the MacAlister, now Blackstone Ranch. He told himself it was merely part of his patrol route, though he'd never bothered to ride this way regularly before. The property was transforming. Fresh lumber replaced rotting porch boards. New glass glinted in previously broken windows. The overgrown fields had been partially cleared, and a small garden plot had been fenced off near the house. The barn door, which had hung from a single hinge for years, was now properly mounted and painted a rich red. As Samuel observed from the road, Rebecca emerged from the barn carrying a pail of milk. She spotted him immediately and raised her hand in greeting. After a moment's hesitation, Samuel tipped his hat in acknowledgement. To his surprise, she began walking toward him. Something inside him urged him to spur Thunder forward to avoid whatever conversation she might initiate. But he remained still, watching her approach. Sheriff Grayson, she called, her breath visible in the crisp autumn air. What perfect timing. Miss Blackstone, he replied evenly. Property's looking improved. Thank you, the men have been working hard. She gestured to the milk pail. I was just about to make some hot chocolate. Would you care to join me? I have some questions about preparing for the winter here. Samuel's instinct was to refuse, just as he refused all social invitations. But the practical side of him recognized that a newcomer asking about winter preparations was sensible. The Montana winters could be deadly for the unprepared. I suppose I could spare a few minutes, he conceded, dismounting. He tied Thunder to a nearby post and followed Rebecca toward the house. The interior had been transformed as much as the exterior. Gone was the layer of dust and abandonment. The floors gleamed with polish, and simple but tasteful curtains hung at the windows. A quilt in shades of blue and green draped over a rocking chair by the hearth, where a modest fire crackled. Please, sit, Rebecca offered, gesturing to the kitchen table while she busied herself at the stove. I won't take much of your time. Samuel sat stiffly, his hat in his hands. He watched as she expertly combined the milk with cocoa powder and a touch of sugar, working with efficient movements. I've been told the snow can get quite deep here, she commented, stirring the mixture. 6 feet or more in the high drifts. That's accurate, Samuel confirmed. You'll want at least 3 cords of wood stacked and covered before the first heavy snow. Extra feed for your livestock, preserves and dried goods to last through February at minimum. Rebecca nodded, pouring the steaming chocolate into 2 mugs. I've started canning what I could from the garden, though it was a late planting. Mrs. Henderson has been helping me locate sources for the rest. She placed a mug before Samuel and took the seat across from him. What about medical supplies? What should I keep on hand? For the next 20 minutes, Samuel found himself engaged in the most extended conversation he'd had in years. Rebecca asked practical questions about winterizing the property, dealing with frozen pumps, treating frostbite, and maintaining trails through the snow. Samuel answered each query thoroughly, surprised by her attentiveness and practical nature. You seem very knowledgeable for someone new to ranching, he observed finally, his hot chocolate nearly gone. Rebecca's smile dimmed slightly. My father owned a small farm in Pennsylvania before his business troubles forced us to sell. I learned a great deal from him. She traced the rim of her mug with a finger. After he died, I could have stayed with relatives, but I needed a fresh start. For the first time, Samuel saw vulnerability beneath her composed exterior. Starting over isn't easy, he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. No, she agreed, meeting his eyes. But necessary sometimes, don't you think? The question hung between them, loaded with meaning Samuel wasn't prepared to address. He finished his chocolate and stood abruptly. I should continue my rounds. Rebecca walked him to the door. Thank you for the advice, Sheriff. I truly appreciate it. As Samuel mounted Thunder, he found himself saying, if you need more firewood, Davies at the lumber mill sells cords at fair prices. Tell him I sent you. Rebecca's smile brightened. I will, thank you. As he rode away, Samuel tried to ignore the strange lightness in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. It was nothing, he told himself. Simple courtesy to a new resident, nothing more. But that night, as he sat alone in his quarters, he found himself thinking of auburn hair and intelligent green eyes asking about winter preparations. And somewhere deep inside, something frozen began to crack. Word traveled quickly in Whiskey Creek that Sheriff Grayson had spent time at the Blackstone Ranch. By the following day, Samuel had endured knowing looks from Mrs. Henderson, raised eyebrows from the blacksmith, and not-so-subtle comments from Judge Potter about community welcoming committees. You all have too much time for gossip, Samuel growled at the men playing cards in the saloon when one made a remark about the Iceman thawing. Come now, Sheriff, said Gerald Mason, the saloon owner. It's not every day you take time to socialize, especially with a pretty newcomer. Samuel fixed him with a cold stare. I was performing my duties, ensuring a new resident is prepared for winter conditions, nothing more. The men exchanged glances but wisely dropped the subject in Samuel's presence. Still, he knew the talk would continue. Small towns thrived on such gossip. For the next week, Samuel deliberately avoided riding past the Blackstone Ranch. He focused on his duties, breaking up a fight at the saloon, investigating stolen merchandise from a freight wagon, and processing paperwork for the territorial court. But on Saturday evening, as Samuel made his final rounds before retiring, he was surprised to see Rebecca Blackstone emerging from the dressmaker's shop. She wore a simple but elegant blue dress, her hair arranged in loose curls rather than her usual practical style. She spotted him immediately. Good evening, Sheriff, Samuel nodded. Miss Blackstone. An awkward silence followed until Rebecca smiled and said, I was just ordering a winter coat. Mrs. Phillips says the one I brought from Pennsylvania wouldn't last a day in a Montana blizzard. She's not wrong, Samuel agreed, noticing how the blue of her dress enhanced the green of her eyes. Rebecca glanced toward the town hall where sounds of music and laughter could be heard. Are you attending the harvest dance? Samuel shook his head. Not my kind of gathering. No. She asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Do you dislike dancing or just celebrations in general? The direct question caught him off guard. Most people in town had long ago stopped expecting him at social events. I have rounds to complete, he said stiffly. Rebecca nodded, seemingly unsurprised by his evasion. Well, I promised Mrs. Henderson I would make an appearance. Apparently, it's an important tradition here. From down the street, a woman's voice called, Rebecca, are you coming, dear? Mrs. Henderson waved from near the town hall steps, her husband beside her. I should go, Rebecca said. Then, with unexpected boldness, she added, You know, Sheriff, it wouldn't be terrible if you decided your rounds included checking on the town hall tonight. Before Samuel could respond, she hurried toward the Hendersons, her blue dress swishing around her ankles. Samuel continued his patrol, telling himself he had no interest in harvest dances or any other frivolous gathering. Yet an hour later, after checking the livery stable and the bank, he found himself standing outside the town hall, listening to the music and laughter within. Just a routine check, he told himself. Large gatherings occasionally led to disturbances. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The hall had been transformed with autumn decorations, bundles of wheat, colorful leaves, and pumpkins adorned every corner. Lanterns cast a warm glow over the proceedings as townsfolk danced to the lively tunes played by a small band. Samuel remained by the entrance, surveying the room with professional detachment. His gaze inevitably found Rebecca, currently dancing with young Thomas Henderson, Mrs. Henderson's nephew. She moved gracefully, laughing at something her partner said. Several people noticed Samuel's presence. Judge Potter raised his glass in greeting from across the room. Mrs. Phillips, the dressmaker, nudged her husband and whispered something that made him look Samuel's way with surprise. Samuel was about to leave when the music ended and Rebecca turned, spotting him immediately. Without hesitation, she excused herself from Thomas and made her way through the crowd toward Samuel. "Sheriff Grayson," she said, slightly breathless from dancing. "You decided to check on us after all." "Just making my rounds," he replied stiffly. Rebecca smiled as if she didn't believe him for a second. "Well, since you're here, would you care for some punch? Mrs. Davidson makes it with real strawberry preserves." Before Samuel could refuse, Judge Potter appeared beside them. "Samuel, what a pleasant surprise. I don't believe I've seen you at a town gathering since." He stopped abruptly, glancing apologetically at Rebecca. "Well, in quite some time. As I was explaining to Miss Blackstone, I'm simply making my rounds," Samuel said. Of course," the judge replied, though his expression suggested he thought otherwise. "Miss Blackstone, you've certainly livened up our little gathering. I don't remember the last time we had such a graceful dancer in Whiskey Creek." Rebecca smiled politely. "You're too kind, Judge. I'm simply enjoying getting to know my new community." The band began playing again, a slower melody this time. "If you'll excuse me," the judge said with a knowing glance between them, "I promised Mrs. Potter this dance." When they were alone again, Rebecca turned to Samuel. "One dance wouldn't compromise your duties, would it, Sheriff?" Samuel stared at her, astonished by her persistence. "I don't dance, Miss Blackstone." "Everyone can dance," she countered. "Some just choose not to." "I choose not to," he confirmed. Rebecca studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I respect your choice, but the offer stands if you change your mind." She gestured to a table near the wall. "At least join me for some punch. I'd appreciate hearing more about the town's history." Something about her, perhaps the genuine interest in her eyes or the way she accepted his refusal without judgment, made Samuel nod reluctantly. 1 cup of punch. They sat at the small table, somewhat removed from the dancers. Rebecca sipped her punch while Samuel held his cup without drinking. "How long have you been sheriff?" she asked. 5 years, he replied, and before that, Samuel hesitated. Few people asked him personal questions anymore. "I ranched with my father north of here." Rebecca nodded. "Do you miss it? Ranching, I mean." "No," he said curtly, though it wasn't entirely true. He did miss parts of that life, the open spaces, the honest work, the simple pleasures of a day well spent. If Rebecca was deterred by his shortness, she didn't show it. "I miss my father's farm sometimes, the apple orchard especially. In autumn, the whole place smelled of ripe apples and cinnamon. My mother would make dozens of pies before she..." She trailed off, a shadow crossing her face. "Before she what?" Samuel found himself asking, curious despite his determination to remain detached. "Before she died," Rebecca finished quietly. "Influenza took her when I was 16. "I'm sorry," Samuel said, the words feeling inadequate but sincere. Rebecca's smile returned, though tinged with sadness. "Life continues, doesn't it? We adapt, find new paths." She looked out at the dancing couples. "Create new memories." Samuel followed her gaze, watching the townsfolk he protected but rarely interacted with beyond his official capacity. Families laughing together, couples holding each other close. The community he kept at arm's length. "Sheriff," Rebecca said suddenly, "may I ask you a personal question?" Samuel tensed but nodded once. "The people here respect you, but they also seem afraid of you. Why is that?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "I enforce the law," he said finally. "That's my job." Not making friends. Those aren't mutually exclusive, she pointed out gently. Samuel felt a flicker of irritation. With all due respect, Miss Blackstone, you've been in Whiskey Creek for all of 2 weeks. You hardly understand how things work here. Instead of being offended, Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. You're right, I'm still learning. But I've always believed that people are fundamentally similar wherever you go. We all want safety, purpose, connection. The word connection hung in the air between them. Samuel stood abruptly. I should continue my rounds. Enjoy the rest of the dance, Miss Blackstone. As he turned to leave, Rebecca's voice stopped him. Thank you for the conversation, Sheriff. I hope we can continue it sometime. Samuel nodded without turning back, then strode out of the town hall into the cool night air. He took a deep breath, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that Rebecca Blackstone saw more in him than he wanted anyone to see. The following morning, Samuel woke earlier than usual, restless after a night of fragmented sleep. Dreams had plagued him unusual for a man who typically slept dreamlessly or not at all. Fragments of dancing figures, green eyes, and burning buildings had twisted together in his subconscious. He dressed and headed to the jail, intending to catch up on paperwork before the town stirred. To his surprise, he found a small package outside the jail door. Inside was a jar of strawberry preserves with a note. Since you didn't try the punch, R.B. Samuel stared at the jar, unsure whether to be annoyed or touched by the gesture. He placed it on his desk and tried to focus on his reports, but found his thoughts continually drifting to the harvest dance and his conversation with Rebecca. By mid-morning, he'd made little progress on his paperwork when Deputy Wilson arrived, looking concerned. Sheriff, there's trouble at the saloon. Stranger in town got into it with Davies from the lumber mill. Mason's holding them apart for now, but it's tense. Samuel grabbed his hat, grateful for the distraction. I'm on my way. At the saloon, he found Gerald Mason standing between two men, Jack Davies, the lumber mill owner, and a hard-faced stranger with a cattle driver's look about him. What's the problem here? Samuel demanded, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the onlookers. This fella's cheating at cards, Davies spat, his face flushed with anger and whiskey. I don't cheat, the stranger drawled. You're just a poor loser. Enough, Samuel said coldly. Mason, what happened? The saloon owner shrugged. Hard to say, Sheriff. Mr. Taylor here's passing through with a cattle drive. Game started friendly enough. Samuel assessed the situation quickly. Davies was a hothead but generally honest. The stranger, Taylor, had the calculating look of a man who might bend rules to his advantage. Show me the cards, Samuel ordered. Reluctantly, Taylor revealed his hand, a suspiciously strong one. Samuel checked the deck and noticed the slight markings on certain cards, visible only if you knew to look for them. Mr. Taylor, Samuel said evenly, I suggest you return Mr. Davies's money and move along. Your cattle drive won't want to be delayed by you spending time in my jail. Taylor's eyes narrowed. You calling me a cheat, Sheriff? I'm giving you a chance to leave town quietly, Samuel replied, his hand resting near his holster. I won't offer twice. A tense moment passed before Taylor cursed under his breath and tossed some money on the table. Keep your backwater town, he muttered, pushing past Samuel toward the door. As the man left, Davies nodded gratefully to Samuel. Thanks, Sheriff. Man had me fooled. Samuel didn't acknowledge the thanks. It's nearly noon, Davies. Don't you have a lumber mill to run? The man sobered quickly under Samuel's stern gaze. Yes, sir. Heading there now. As the crowd dispersed, Samuel noticed Rebecca standing near the entrance, watching him with an unreadable expression. Their eyes met briefly before she turned and left without a word. Samuel followed her outside. Miss Blackstone, she turned, her expression guarded. That was well handled, Sheriff. Did you need something in town? He asked, wondering why she'd been at the saloon. I was meeting with Mr. Davies about my firewood order, as you suggested, she explained. When I arrived, I was told he was at the saloon. Samuel nodded. He should be heading back to the mill now. Rebecca studied him for a moment. You know, you have a remarkable ability to command respect without raising your voice or drawing your weapon." The observation caught him off guard. Most people only saw the threat of force behind his authority, not the careful restraint. "It's just doing my job," he said finally. "Perhaps," she agreed, "but how we do our job says a lot about who we are." She glanced at the sun. "I should find Mr. Davies before he forgets our appointment entirely." As she turned to leave, Samuel found himself saying, "Thank you for the preserves." Rebecca smiled, the guardedness in her expression melting away. "You're welcome, Sheriff. Good day." Samuel watched her walk toward the lumber mill, her posture straight and purposeful. Something about Rebecca Blackstone continually surprised him: her directness, her perceptiveness, her refusal to be intimidated by his cold demeanor. For the rest of the day, Samuel found his thoughts returning to her words about how people do their jobs reflecting who they are. He'd built his reputation on being hard but fair, unyielding but just. When had that translated to being feared rather than respected? And why had it never bothered him until now? The weeks following the harvest dance brought the first serious snowfall to Whiskey Creek. Samuel increased his patrols, particularly to the outlying properties where residents might become stranded in severe weather. He told himself his frequent rides past the Blackstone Ranch were part of this duty, nothing more. From a distance, he observed the preparations. Rebecca had made a substantial wood pile covered with oilcloth, smoke rising steadily from the chimney, and paths cleared between the house and barn. She had heeded his advice well. On one particularly cold afternoon, as Samuel rode past, he noticed Rebecca struggling to lead one of her milk cows back to the barn through the deep snow. Without conscious decision, he directed thunder toward her property. "Need assistance, Miss Blackstone?" He called as he approached. Rebecca looked up, surprise evident on her face. Snow dusted her woolen coat and hat, and her cheeks were flushed from exertion and cold. "Sheriff," Matilda here decided the snow looked interesting and broke through the fence. "I've been trying to convince her that the warm barn is preferable." Samuel dismounted, taking the rope from Rebecca's gloved hands. The cow eyed him warily but didn't resist as he led her firmly toward the barn. Rebecca walked alongside, catching her breath. "Thank you," she said as they reached the barn door. "I was beginning to think we'd both freeze before she saw reason." Inside the barn, Samuel secured the cow in her stall while Rebecca fetched feed. The space was well organized and surprisingly warm, with hay bales stacked neatly and tools hanging in proper places. "You've done well preparing for winter," Samuel commented, looking around approvingly. "I followed expert advice," Rebecca replied with a small smile. "Would you like some coffee?" "It's the least I can offer for the rescue." Samuel knew he should refuse, continue his patrol, maintain the distance he kept from everyone in town. But the barn was warm, and the thought of Rebecca's company was suddenly more appealing than the solitude that awaited him at the jail. "Coffee would be welcome," he said finally. Rebecca's smile brightened as she led the way to the house. Inside, the main room was cozy and inviting. A fire burned cheerfully in the hearth, and the aroma of fresh bread filled the air. Books were stacked on a small table beside the rocking chair, and a half-finished quilt lay folded nearby. "Please make yourself comfortable," Rebecca said, taking his coat and hanging it near the fire to warm. "I'll only be a moment." Samuel stood awkwardly in the center of the room, unused to being a guest in anyone's home. Eventually, he settled in a chair by the fire, watching as Rebecca moved efficiently around the kitchen area, preparing coffee and slicing bread still warm from the oven. "I received a letter from Judge Harmon yesterday," she mentioned as she worked. "The snow delayed the mail, but he sends his regards and hopes I'm settling in well." "And are you?" Samuel found himself asking. "Settling in well?" Rebecca brought over 2 cups of coffee and a plate of bread with butter and preserves. "I am, actually, better than I expected." She sat across from him. "The people here have been kind for the most part." Mrs. Henderson checks on me regularly, and the Jensen boys stop by to ensure the roof is holding up under the snow. Samuel nodded, taking a sip of coffee. It was rich and strong, exactly as he preferred it. Whiskey Creek looks after its own. Is that what I am now, one of Whiskey Creek's own? There was a hint of teasing in her voice, but also genuine curiosity. You're putting down roots, Samuel observed. That counts for something. They fell into surprisingly comfortable conversation as they enjoyed the coffee and bread. Rebecca asked about the town's history, and Samuel found himself sharing stories he'd heard from the old-timers' tales of the first settlers. The harsh winter of '68 that nearly wiped out the town. The silver strike that brought prosperity before petering out. In turn, Rebecca spoke of her life in Pennsylvania, her father's prosperous farm, the financial troubles that came after her mother's death, and her decision to start fresh after inheriting a modest sum from her father. He always talked about going west, she explained, a wistful note in her voice. He never got the chance, so I suppose I'm living that dream for both of us now. As the afternoon light began to fade, Samuel realized with a start how long he'd stayed. I should continue my patrol, he said, rising from his chair. Rebecca walked him to the door. Thank you again for your help with Matilda. At the threshold, Samuel paused. If the snow gets worse and you need assistance, send word to town. Someone will come. Will that someone be you, Sheriff? Rebecca asked, her green eyes meeting his directly. The question hung between them, layered with meaning beyond the simple words. Samuel found himself unable to look away from her gaze. Yes, he said finally, the word emerging rougher than he intended. It would be me. Something shifted in Rebecca's expression, a softening, a quiet acknowledgement of something neither of them had named. Good to know, she said simply. As Samuel rode back toward town through the deepening twilight, he realized the frozen place within him had thawed further than he'd thought possible. And for the first time in years, the prospect didn't terrify him. 3 days later, a blizzard struck Whiskey Creek with unexpected ferocity. Snow fell in blinding sheets, driven by howling winds that created drifts taller than a man. The temperature plummeted, freezing everything in its path. Samuel organized the townspeople into teams, checking on residents and distributing firewood to those running low. He worked tirelessly, his thoughts continually returning to the Blackstone ranch. The road there would be impassable now, the ranch isolated until the storm passed. On the second night of the blizzard, as Samuel sat in the jail warming himself by the stove, Deputy Wilson burst in, covered in snow. Sheriff Ryder just came in from the East Road, he reported breathlessly. Says there's a fire at one of the outlying properties. Couldn't tell which one exactly through the snow, but saw flames before the blizzard blocked his view. Samuel's blood turned to ice. East Road, how far out? 4, maybe 5 miles, he thinks. The Blackstone Ranch. Samuel was already reaching for his heaviest coat. Get Mason and Davies. Tell them to follow with supplies once the main route is cleared enough. You're not going out in this? Wilson asked incredulously. Sheriff, you'll freeze before you get halfway there. I know that route better than anyone, Samuel replied, checking his pistol and grabbing extra ammunition. And Thunder can navigate in conditions that would stop other horses. Before Wilson could protest further, Samuel was out the door, fighting his way through the swirling snow to the livery stable. Thunder snorted in protest as Samuel saddled him, but the loyal stallion didn't resist when led outside into the raging storm. The journey that normally took less than an hour stretched into an agonizing ordeal. Samuel kept Thunder moving through snowdrifts that sometimes reached the horse's chest, following landmarks he could barely see through the blinding white. The cold cut through his clothes, numbing his face and hands despite his heavy gloves. As he approached where the ranch should be, Samuel strained to see any sign of fire through the swirling snow. At first he saw nothing. Then a gust of wind momentarily cleared the air and his heart sank. Orange flames licked at the roof of the barn, partially collapsed under the weight of snow and fire. Samuel urged Thunder forward with renewed urgency, reaching the property in minutes that felt like hours. He dismounted near the house, relieved to see it still intact, and secured Thunder in the relative shelter of a woodshed. "Rebecca," he shouted, pounding on the door, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. No answer came. Fear gripping him, Samuel tried the door and found it unlocked. He burst inside, calling her name again. The house was empty, the fire in the hearth burning low. A half-empty cup of tea sat on the table, still warm to the touch. She must have gone to the barn when the fire started. Samuel grabbed a lantern and fought his way back outside toward the burning structure. The barn door hung open, swinging wildly in the wind. Through the smoke and snow, he could make out the silhouettes of frantic animals. The cows had been released, but were huddled against the side of the barn, confused by the storm. "Rebecca," Samuel called again, scanning the area desperately. A faint sound answered him, not a voice, but a distressed moaning from inside the barn. Despite the flames now consuming most of the roof, Samuel pushed forward into the smoke-filled structure. Through the haze, he spotted her. Rebecca lay partially pinned beneath a fallen beam, conscious but clearly injured. Next to her, Matilda the cow stood protectively, refusing to flee while her mistress was trapped. "Samuel," Rebecca gasped when she saw him, using his given name for the first time. "The lantern fell when the roof started, got the animals out, but—" "Don't talk," Samuel ordered, assessing the situation quickly. The beam was heavy but not impossible to move. The real danger was the burning roof above them, which could collapse completely at any moment. With a surge of strength born of desperation, Samuel heaved the beam off Rebecca's legs. She cried out in pain as she was freed, confirming his fear that her leg was broken. "Put your arms around my neck," he commanded, bending to lift her. Rebecca complied, her body trembling with cold and shock. Samuel gathered her against his chest and stood, carrying her toward the door. He whistled sharply at Matilda, who finally turned and followed them out of the burning barn. The journey back to the house was a battle against the elements, but Samuel's determination never wavered. Inside, he laid Rebecca gently on the sofa and quickly built up the fire before examining her injuries. "My leg," she said through gritted teeth, "and I think my ribs when the beam fell." Samuel nodded grimly. "I need to splint that leg before we can move you to town." "Town?" Rebecca shook her head weakly. In this storm, impossible. She was right, Samuel realized. They were trapped here until the blizzard subsided, which could be days according to the heavy clouds he'd observed. "Then we'll make do," he said with more confidence than he felt. "Where do you keep your medical supplies?" Under Rebecca's direction, Samuel located bandages, alcohol, and straight pieces of wood that could serve as splints. With as much gentleness as his rough hands could manage, he removed her boot and assessed the break. "This will hurt," he warned, meeting her eyes. Rebecca nodded, her face pale but determined. "I trust you." The simple declaration hit Samuel with unexpected force. When was the last time anyone had looked at him with such complete trust? With careful movements, Samuel set the bone as best he could, his heart clenching at Rebecca's muffled cries of pain. He splinted the leg securely, then checked her ribs, which appeared bruised but not broken. "You were lucky," he said when he'd finished. "If that beam had fallen differently—" He couldn't complete the thought. The image of finding her too late, of losing her to fire as he had lost Samuel. Rebecca's voice broke through his dark thoughts. Her hand reached for his, fingers still cold from exposure. "Thank you for coming. How did you know?" Samuel explained about the rider who'd spotted the fire. "I wasn't certain it was your property, but I had to check. You risked your life," she said softly. "In this blizzard you could have." She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. "I made a promise," Samuel replied simply. "I said I would come if you needed help." Rebecca's grip on his hand tightened. "The animals, the cows, are sheltering against the south wall of the house. The chickens, in a coop attached to the house," she said, relieved, "but everything in the barn, the feed, the tools." "We'll worry about that later," Samuel assured her. For now, you need rest." He helped her drink some water, then built up the fire to keep the house warm through the night. Outside, the blizzard continued unabated, transforming the landscape into an impenetrable white void. They were completely isolated until the storm passed. As the adrenaline of the rescue faded, Samuel suddenly realized the intimacy of their situation. They were alone, trapped together for at least a day, possibly longer. In all his years as sheriff, he had maintained careful boundaries with everyone in Whiskey Creek, especially women. Now those boundaries had been obliterated by circumstance. Rebecca seemed to sense his discomfort. "There's a spare bedroom through that door," she said, gesturing weakly. "You should rest too." "I'm fine," Samuel insisted, settling into a chair near the fire where he could keep watch over both Rebecca and the blizzard outside. As the night deepened, Rebecca drifted into an uneasy sleep, her face tight with pain even in unconsciousness. Samuel watched the rise and fall of her chest, the flickering firelight illuminating her features. He found himself studying her in a way he wouldn't have dared if she were awake, the delicate curve of her jaw, the small scar near her left eyebrow, the strand of auburn hair that had escaped her braid. In sleep, the strength she carried so effortlessly was softened, revealing the vulnerability she rarely allowed others to see. Samuel realized with startling clarity that he admired her, not just her beauty, but her courage, her determination, her refusal to be deterred by either his coldness or the challenges of starting over alone in a harsh land. The realization disturbed him, forcing him to confront emotions he'd buried long ago. After Emily and little Sarah died in the fire, he had sworn never to care that deeply again. The pain of loss had been too great, the guilt too overwhelming. He had failed to protect his family. He wouldn't fail Whiskey Creek as its sheriff. That meant remaining detached, focused, uncompromised by personal feelings. Yet here he was, risking his life in a blizzard for a woman he barely knew, a woman who had somehow breached the walls around his heart without even trying. As if sensing his troubled thoughts, Rebecca stirred, her eyes opening slowly. "Samuel," she murmured, disoriented, "is it still night?" "Yes," he replied, moving to her side. "How's the pain?" "Bearable," she said, though the tightness around her eyes suggested otherwise. "You should sleep." "I'm keeping watch," he said. Rebecca studied him in the firelight. "You're always keeping watch, aren't you? Over the town, over everyone." "Who watches over you, Samuel Grayson?" The question struck him speechless. No one had asked him such a thing in years, perhaps ever. "I don't need watching over," he said finally. Rebecca's lips curved in a small, sad smile. "Everyone does sometimes." Before he could respond, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows, drawing his attention. "Storm's getting worse," he observed, moving to check that the shutters were secure. When he returned to Rebecca's side, she had pushed herself up slightly, wincing with the effort. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her expression serious. "In case you're going to be fine," Samuel interrupted firmly. "Once the storm passes, we'll get you to Doc Morrison." "I know," she assured him, "but near-death experiences have a way of clarifying things." She took a deep breath. "I came to Whiskey Creek for a fresh start, that's true, but I also came because of you." Samuel stared at her, certain he had misheard. "What?" "Judge Harmon told me about you," Rebecca explained, "about what happened to your family. About how you changed afterward, becoming the man everyone now fears instead of the man you were before." Samuel felt as if he'd been struck. "Judge Harmon had no right. He cares about you," Rebecca continued gently. "He was Emily's uncle. Did you know that?" Of course Samuel knew. Judge Harmon had been at the funeral, had tried to speak with Samuel afterward, but Samuel had shut him out along with everyone else. "What does this have to do with you coming here?" Samuel demanded, his voice harsh with suppressed emotion. Rebecca held his gaze steadily. "The judge thought you needed someone who wouldn't be intimidated by the walls you've built, someone stubborn enough to see past them." A hint of her usual determination flashed in her eyes. "I needed a fresh start. You needed to remember how to live again. He thought perhaps we could help each other." Samuel stood abruptly, anger and confusion warring within him. So this was all some kind of plan, your interest in me, your questions, your… No, Rebecca said firmly. Judge Harmon may have suggested Whiskey Creek, may have helped with the property purchase, but everything else, everything between us has been real. Her voice softened. I couldn't have pretended to care for you, Samuel. That part happened all on its own. Samuel turned away, unable to face the sincerity in her eyes. The revelation that his past, the past he'd tried so hard to bury, had been discussed, that Rebecca had known all along about Emily and Sarah, made him feel exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't allowed himself to be in 5 long years. You should have told me, he said finally, his back still turned to her. Perhaps, Rebecca conceded, but would you have given me a chance if I had? Or would you have shut me out completely, as you've done with everyone else who tries to reach you? The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable because they both knew the truth. He would have avoided her at all costs had he known her connection to Judge Harmon, known that she was aware of his painful past. Outside, the wind howled, mirroring the turmoil within Samuel. Part of him wanted to retreat into the familiar coldness that had protected him for so long. Another part he'd thought long dead yearned to turn around, to accept what Rebecca was offering, understanding, compassion, perhaps even love. I need some air, he said abruptly, moving toward the door. Samuel, the blizzard, Rebecca began, alarmed. Just to check on the animals, he assured her, his voice gentler than he intended. I'll be back. Outside, the cold hit him like a physical blow, clearing his head somewhat. The barn still smoldered despite the snow, the last flames extinguished, but the timbers glowing red in places. The cows huddled miserably against the house, and Samuel spent a few minutes constructing a better windbreak for them using boards from the woodpile. The physical labor helped calm his churning thoughts. By the time he returned to the house, snow-covered but composed, he had reached a decision. Rebecca watched him anxiously as he shed his coat and boots. The animals, they'll survive, he said, moving to stoke the fire. Like their mistress. Rebecca seemed to sense the change in his demeanor. Samuel, I'm sorry for not telling you sooner. I never meant to deceive you. Samuel sat beside her on the edge of the sofa, his eyes meeting hers directly. For 5 years, I've lived half a life, he said quietly. After Emily and Sarah died because I wasn't there to protect them from that fire, I swore I'd never let myself care that deeply again. Rebecca's hand found his, her fingers warm against his cold ones. Caring isn't a weakness, Samuel. It felt like one, he admitted. Every time I looked at a family in town, every time I heard children laughing, it was a reminder of what I'd lost, what I'd failed to protect. You didn't fail them, Rebecca said firmly. Accidents happen, terrible ones, but they're not your fault. Samuel shook his head slightly. I was the one who left the lantern too close to the curtains. I was the one who went to check on the horses instead of being in the house by the time I saw the flames. His voice broke, the memory still vivid after all these years, and you've punished yourself ever since, Rebecca said softly. Denied yourself any joy, any connection. Do you think that's what Emily would have wanted for you? The question pierced through him like a physical pain. No, Emily wouldn't have wanted this half-life he'd created. The woman who had loved wildflowers and dancing, who had laughed so easily and loved so generously, would have been heartbroken to see what he had become. When I saw your barn on fire tonight, Samuel said, his voice barely audible, all I could think was not again, not losing someone I. He couldn't finish the sentence. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. Someone you what, Samuel? Someone I care about, he admitted finally. Someone who made me remember what it feels like to want to live, not just exist. The confession hung in the air between them, more significant than any words Samuel had spoken in years. Rebecca's hand tightened around his, and slowly, hesitantly, she leaned forward despite the pain it clearly caused her. Samuel met her halfway, his lips finding hers in a kiss that felt like coming home after an endless journey. It was gentle, tentative at first, then deepening as 5 years of carefully constructed walls crumbled completely. When they finally parted, Rebecca's eyes shone with something Samuel had almost forgotten existed: hope. "I'm not asking you to forget them," she whispered, "just to make room in your heart for new memories alongside the old ones." Samuel touched her cheek gently, marveling at the softness of her skin beneath his calloused fingers. "I think perhaps you've already started that process, Rebecca Blackstone." They talked through the night as the blizzard gradually spent its fury outside. Samuel spoke of Emily and Sarah, sharing memories he had kept locked away for years: Emily's talent for baking pies that won ribbons at county fairs, little Sarah's infectious giggle when he tossed her into the air. The pain was still there, but somehow transformed by the sharing, becoming something he could carry without being crushed by its weight. In turn, Rebecca told him more about her own losses: her mother's long illness, her father's struggle to keep the farm going afterward, his eventual descent into debt that cost them their home. She spoke of her determination to create something new here in Montana, something that would honor her parents' memory while being uniquely her own. As dawn broke, the storm finally subsided, leaving a transformed landscape of pristine white outside the windows. Samuel checked on the animals again, relieved to find them all surviving, if uncomfortable. By mid-morning, the sound of voices and horses announced the arrival of help from town. Gerald Mason, Jack Davies, and Deputy Wilson had fought their way through the partially cleared road, bringing supplies and a wagon fitted with runners for the snow. Their surprised expressions at finding the sheriff already at the ranch quickly gave way to concerned efficiency as they assessed the damage to the barn and Rebecca's injuries. "We need to get Miss Blackstone to Doc Morrison," Samuel instructed as Mason helped him carefully move Rebecca to the wagon. "Wilson, you stay here with Davies and secure what's left of the property. We'll send more help from town once the roads are better cleared." As they prepared to depart, Rebecca caught Samuel's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, the words encompassing far more than his rescue the previous night. Samuel squeezed her hand gently, aware of the curious gazes of Mason and the others. "I'll be right beside you," he promised. The journey to town was slow but steady, the runners of the wagon sliding over the packed snow. Samuel rode thunder alongside, never straying from Rebecca's side. By the time they reached Whiskey Creek, word had spread, and a small crowd had gathered outside the doctor's office. As Samuel carried Rebecca inside, he was conscious of the whispers and stares, the townspeople's shock at seeing their stern, unapproachable sheriff cradling the newcomer with such obvious care. For the first time in years, he found he didn't mind their scrutiny. Doc Morrison confirmed what Samuel had suspected: a clean break to the lower leg that would heal well given time and rest, along with bruised ribs and minor burns. "You're lucky, Miss Blackstone," the doctor said as he finished applying a proper cast. "And fortunate the sheriff reached you when he did." "I know," Rebecca replied, her eyes finding Samuel's across the room. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Samuel organized repairs to the Blackstone barn, calling on the town for assistance. To his surprise, the response was overwhelming. Men volunteered labor, women brought food and supplies, children carried messages and smaller items. It was as if the town had been waiting for an opportunity to come together in a way they hadn't in years. Samuel divided his time between his sheriff's duties and overseeing the reconstruction efforts. Each evening, he visited Rebecca at Mrs. Henderson's home, where she was recovering until she could safely return to her ranch. A week after the fire, as they sat together in Mrs. Henderson's parlor, the older woman tactfully finding reasons to be elsewhere, Rebecca studied Samuel thoughtfully. "You look different," she observed. Samuel raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "Less burdened," she decided. "The townspeople have noticed too. Mrs. Phillips says you actually smiled at her yesterday when she greeted you." Samuel hadn't realized he'd smiled, but he didn't doubt it. Something fundamental had shifted within him since the night of the blizzard. The grief and guilt he'd carried for so long hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined him completely. "I've been thinking," he said, taking Rebecca's hand, "about what happens when you're well enough to return to your ranch." Rebecca tilted her head questioningly. "What about it?" Samuel took a deep breath. What he was about to propose went against everything he'd believed possible for himself since Emily's death. Yet it felt right in a way nothing had in years. "I don't want to go back to being just Sheriff Grayson to you," he said simply. "I don't want to go back to being the man everyone fears and avoids." Rebecca's fingers tightened around his. "What do you want, Samuel?" "A second chance," he replied, meeting her gaze directly. "At living, not just existing. At loving, not just remembering love." He hesitated, then added, "With you, if you'll have me." Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "I came to Whiskey Creek hoping to help you find your way back to yourself," she said softly. "I never expected to find my own heart along the way." Samuel leaned forward, his forehead touching hers. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," Rebecca whispered, her lips finding his in a kiss that promised new beginnings. 2 months later, as spring began to transform the Montana landscape, Samuel Grayson and Rebecca Blackstone were married in a simple ceremony at the newly rebuilt Blackstone Ranch. The entire town attended, many still marveling at the transformation in their once forbidding sheriff. "Never seen anything like it," Gerald Mason commented to Mrs. Henderson as they watched the couple exchange vows. "One day he's cold as January ice, the next he's helping rebuild barns and smiling at folks on the street." Mrs. Henderson smiled knowingly. "Sometimes all it takes is the right person to remind us who we truly are beneath our armor." As Samuel slipped a simple gold band onto Rebecca's finger, his eyes never leaving hers, the whispers of the townspeople faded away. In that moment, there was only Rebecca, the woman whose smile had somehow reached through 5 years of carefully constructed walls in a single night. The woman who had given him the courage to remember how to live again. "I promise to honor the past we both carry," Samuel said softly, adding words to the traditional vows, "while building a future filled with the joy and love we've found together." Rebecca's eyes shone with happy tears as she repeated her own vows. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel gathered her in his arms, no longer concerned with maintaining the stern image he'd hidden behind for so long. The celebration continued well into the evening, with dancing and feasting that would have been unimaginable in Whiskey Creek just months before. Samuel found himself drawn into conversations with townspeople who had previously given him a wide berth, accepting congratulations and well wishes with a warmth that surprised even him. As twilight descended, he found Rebecca sitting on the new porch swing he'd built as a wedding gift. She smiled as he joined her, nestling against his side as naturally as if they'd been together for years instead of months. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Completely," she replied, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Though I was thinking about what Mrs. Phillips said earlier." "What was that?" Rebecca's lips curved in an amused smile. "That the neighbors always said Samuel Grayson was too hard, too cold to ever marry again, that no one could have imagined a woman's smile would soften you in a single night." Samuel chuckled, the sound still somewhat unfamiliar but increasingly natural. They weren't entirely wrong. Rebecca turned to face him, her expression growing serious. "It wasn't just a single night, though, was it? It was every conversation, every moment we shared." The night of the blizzard simply brought everything into focus. Samuel touched her cheek gently. "You're right, as usual, but there was something special about that first night at the harvest dance when you refused to be intimidated by me. When you looked at me and somehow saw past the man I'd become to the man I could be again." "I saw you," Rebecca said simply. "Just you, Samuel, not the tragedy, not the sheriff's badge, just the good man underneath it all." As the stars multiplied overhead and the sounds of celebration continued in the distance, Samuel Grayson held his wife close, marveling at how completely his life had transformed. The pain of his past would always be with him, but it no longer defined his future. That future now belonged to him and Rebecca, to the family they hoped to build, to the love that had found him when he least expected it but most needed it. And if the neighbors of Whiskey Creek still sometimes whispered about how Rebecca Blackstone had accomplished the impossible, softening the hardest man in the territory with nothing more than her smile and her unwavering belief in the goodness beneath his armor, well, Samuel couldn't find it in himself to mind. Because they were right, after all. She had saved him, not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with the simple, powerful magic of seeing him as he truly was, and offering him the chance to become that man again. 5 years later, Samuel stood on the porch of the thriving Blackstone Grayson ranch, watching as Rebecca chased their 3-year-old daughter Sarah through rows of newly planted apple trees. Nearby, their 1-year-old son James crawled determinedly after a butterfly, his chubby legs not quite mastering the art of walking. The ranch had prospered under their joint care. The rebuilt barn now housed twice as many animals as before, the fields yielded bountiful harvests, and the apple orchard Rebecca had insisted on planting, a piece of my childhood for our children to enjoy, was finally beginning to bear fruit. Samuel still served as sheriff of Whiskey Creek, though the job had changed as he had. Where once he had been feared, he was now respected. Where he had been avoided, he was now sought out for his fair judgment and surprising compassion. As Rebecca scooped up their giggling daughter and made her way back toward him, Samuel felt the familiar swell of gratitude that had become part of his daily life. The loss of his first family would always be a scar he carried, but Rebecca had shown him that scars could mark survival as much as suffering. "What are you thinking about, looking so serious?" Rebecca asked as she climbed the porch steps, their daughter squirming to be put down. Samuel smiled, the expression now coming easily to him. "About how lucky I am, about second chances." Rebecca's eyes softened as she released Sarah, who immediately darted off to investigate her brother's butterfly hunt. "We made a good life, didn't we?" "The best," Samuel agreed, pulling her into his arms. And it all started with a stubborn woman who refused to be intimidated by the town's meanest sheriff. Rebecca laughed, the sound still his favorite music after all these years. "I prefer to think of it as starting with a good man who just needed reminding of who he truly was." As they stood together watching their children play in the spring sunshine, Samuel Grayson, once the hardest man in Whiskey Creek, now known as its most fortunate, silently thanked whatever fate or providence had brought Rebecca Blackstone into his life that autumn day. One woman's smile had indeed softened him in what seemed like a single night, but her love had transformed him every day since, reminding him that even the deepest wounds could heal with time, understanding, and the courage to open one's heart again. And in that healing, he had found not just recovery, but renewal, a life richer and more complete than he could have imagined during those dark years alone. The neighbors who had once whispered about his coldness now spoke of his good fortune, of the family that had bloomed from what had seemed barren ground, of the second chance that had come in the form of a determined woman with auburn hair and unwavering faith in the goodness she saw within him. It was, Samuel reflected as he pressed a kiss to his wife's temple, the most unexpected and precious gift of his life, to be seen, to be known, and to be loved not despite his broken places, but because of the strength it had taken to carry them for so long. And that gift had begun with a smile on a stormy night, a smile that had somehow reached past all his defenses and reminded his frozen heart how to beat again.